Dear participant, in this session we will guide you through a lesson on a few practical aspects of patient activism and advocacy. We will discuss the case study of the European AIDS Treatment Group, one of the largest and oldest European patient organizations in the field of HIV and AIDS. You will hear about examples of both advocacy and activism, and a little bit about the theoretical background to the work that patient advocates do or can do to promote the interests of their peers. You can stop the presentation movie at any time, think about the contents, jot down your questions and comments. Please feel free to get in touch with the author on the addresses indicated at the end of the presentation. Let's start by discussing the difference between advocacy and activism. There are different definitions used in the literature, and we use a synthesis of these approaches here. Both are tools of the civil society to pursue politics in practical terms and in a bottom-up approach. Advocacy is mostly defined as the softer, more diplomatic way of enforcing interests. Talks around tables, persistent lobbying, capacity building within the community concerned, the development of interest platforms are some key aspects of this work. Activism, on the other hand, is the louder, more visible type of representing interests. Demonstrations, press releases, direct actions belong into this category. Both tools can be equally useful and legitimate. However, it is absolutely essential that patient organizations and the expert patients involved in them are completely clear and in agreement about the objectives, the strategy that can help achieve these objectives, and the tools they wish to use to achieve them. The compilation of a thorough advocacy plan is therefore unavoidable and also very useful. There are many resources available on the internet that can facilitate the process of devising and implementing an advocacy plan. Advocacy and activism tools used can range from diplomatic talks through press releases and lobbying with politicians to street demonstrations and sit-ins. No tool can or should be ruled out, but a lot of thinking and attention need to go into which tool to use in which situation. Patients also need to make sure that they don't use all the tools at the same time and have the possibility to escalate or tone down their actions in reaction to what they have achieved. Patient advocacy needs to be flexible. The next slides will discuss, in rough outline, the emergence and development of HIV and AIDS activism. This will then be followed by some general theoretical remarks. The timeline of HIV and AIDS starts in the early 80s. The first outbreaks were limited to the communities of gay men. This was a particularly underprivileged group at the time. Therefore, there was little attention paid to the incidents. Researchers initially also did not realize the risks associated with an appearance of a completely new pathogen. Pharmaceutical companies and authorities did not see the potential dangers, but also the manner in which the virus spread was unclear in the beginning. The case of AIDS is particularly interesting because it demonstrates how health, politics, identity matters, human rights, morale, and socio-economic factors interplay in a complex way. The emergence of HIV activism happened in this rare and unique political constellation. During the Reagan and Thatcher administrations in the USA and the UK, liberation movements of people of color, women and gays were all strengthening, and all of them were, to a certain extent, motivated by some degree of anger. Anger and frustration were, and oftentimes are, the driving forces behind some advocacy movements. Often raised in families of hippie counterculture, activists at the time were growing more and more conscious of their rights and possibilities. Emotions, feeling like anger, compassion, outrage and love, play an essential role in what patient activists do. Denying emotions when a mother fights for access to medication for a dying child, or when a young gay man does not want to die of AIDS at the age of 25, is myopic. Emotions are not childish, they are a part of life. Some doctors and some researchers consider that having emotions is unprofessional. And this denial of the validity of emotions, however unintentional, is used to castrate patient or any civil movements because it questions their impartiality and their judgment-making capacities. Hence, HIV activism was born, demanding acknowledgement of the immediate health crisis, but also the initiation of research and development into medicines to save the lives of thousands. By 1986, when AZT, the first effective compound against HIV, was discovered, about 16,000 people were already suffering from AIDS in the USA. The traditional medicine research model requires rigorous testing and assessment of the experimental compounds. Placebo-controlled trials with hard clinical endpoints like death were, however, unacceptable for a community that was simply dying faster than the time span of the trials and the registration processes. Already the first clinical trial of AZT had to be stopped early in 1986 as the rate of deaths was too high in the placebo arm. In the meantime, in 1986 and 1987, the epidemic was spreading like wildfire, spilling over to the general population, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. The world saw a major crisis emerging. The WHO and the United Nations started treating HIV differently from other diseases. But the registration process by the FDA was still drawn out. Finally, in 1988, 1,000 ACT-UP demonstrators, patient activists, practically shut down the FDA building in Washington, D.C. and held it under occupation for 8 days. You may have seen the movie Dallas Buyers Club. This short video is the trailer of the movie. Buyers clubs were grassroots, even renegade organizations that procured HIV medicines from outside the USA and distributed them to those in need when these medicines were not officially available. There was also plenty of criticism against placebo-controlled trials and the death of patients as a clinical endpoint. Patient activists had no choice but to try to learn as much of their disease as possible. Hence the concept of the expert patient was born. Patient activists and research physicians could jointly make sure that death as an endpoint was replaced by surrogate endpoints that still today provide an accurate reflection of the immune system.
Mr. Woodruff, you've tested positive for HIV. Have you ever used intravenous drugs? Have you ever engaged in homosexual conduct?
Homo. You say homo? You made a mistake. That ain't me.
Mr. Woodruff, we estimate you have 30 days left.
And newsflash for y'all. There ain't nothing out there can kill Ron Woodruff in 30 days. Them drugs, they just released for testing, and I know this hospital's one of the size. I need it.
It doesn't work that way, Mr. Woodruff. Where are you going?
They got good meds out of Mexico that's better than what you can get here in the States.
This is protein, totally non-toxic.
You can't buy this in the USA.
Not approved.
You could be making a fortune off of this.
You look great.
Well, actually, I look amazing.
Anything to declare?
Nada.
That importing illegal drugs for sale is a very serious offense.
They're not illegal. They're merely unapproved.
I've been looking for you, Lone Star.
Listen, Tinkerbell, unless you got more cash or new clients, I'm busy.
You don't deserve our money.
Cut you in 5%.
25, take it or leave it.
Welcome to the Dallas Buyers Club.
You treating these people?
Oh, they're treating themselves. Well, I ain't selling drugs. I'm selling membership.
Walker, Dorsett, these are patients.
Yes, sir.
They're also the names of players on the Dallas Cowboys.
That's a hell of a coincidence.
The hell is it?
I have a court order permitting us to confiscate any and all non-FDA approved supplements.
We need a new supply. Check Amsterdam, China, and Israel.
Good doing business with you.
Why are we here?
Nice restaurant, beautiful woman. That's where I feel like a human again.
Mr. Woodruff, what is going on?
People are dying.
You're nothing more than a common drug dealer.
TJ, this is Rayon.
Freaking homo. one life.
You ain't alone.
Wanted to mean something.
Just let me be your ticket home.
The case of Ryan White is also of outstanding importance in the history of HIV advocacy. This young man, a hemophiliac who was infected with HIV through blood transfusion as a child, and his family fought relentlessly against the discrimination of people living with HIV. The first piece of legislation on providing care and support to people with HIV and their families in the USA was named the Ryan White Care Act after his death in 1990. The video linked here is a short documentary on his life and struggle.
ABC News, World News, Sunday. Here's Forrest Sawyer.
Good evening. 18-year-old Ryan White, who struggled 5.5 years to overcome AIDS and prejudice, died early this morning of complications resulting from the disease. Ryan said he only wanted to be a normal, happy teenager. Instead, he became a national spokesman for AIDS victims and helped educate a nation. ABC's Beth Nissen remembers how he lived.
Ryan White was the bravest kind of soldier, the kind who goes first on the path. He was diagnosed with AIDS 5 years ago when he was 13, one of the first children known to have AIDS at that time. He spent the rest of his life fighting two invisible but powerful enemies, the virus inside him and the infectious fear and ignorance that surrounded him.
They wrote fag on his folder inside his locker and put a lot of obscenities on magic marker. They wrote his locker all up.
Parents in Ryan's hometown of Russiaville, Indiana, tried to keep Ryan out of school. The courts ordered him admitted, but he had to use a separate bathroom, eat his lunch alone.
There was a lot of people who thought that if you breathe the same air, you can get AIDS.
Students in Cicero, Indiana, knew better. When Ryan and his mother moved there, they were welcomed. Ryan grew taller and made friends, grew weaker, but kept talking about AIDS. Certainly will. 1 million Americans are infected with the AIDS virus, and half of them do not know they are. Too many of those most at risk, IV drug abusers, their sex partners, and their children, do nothing to protect against AIDS. Too many of those who do know about AIDS still do nothing to protect against it. Ryan White founded a national organization of athletes and entertainers to spread the word on what AIDS is and how to avoid it, to carry the message when he no longer could. Celebrities, including Michael Jackson, began arriving in Cicero today to honor Ryan, to wish him Godspeed.
I believe in God, and, I believe there's a heaven. And I just, I think when you die, you're going to go to a better place.
Compassion, authenticity, and sound knowledge about the biology and social collaterals of their disease are the key factors for success for patient advocates. Experience shows that advocacy can be successful only if patient advocates rely on the latest scientific knowledge about their disease and related conditions, including social or psychological aspects, as well as having a sound knowledge of the processes necessary to research and develop medicines. Research also shows that the path to becoming a patient advocate is empowering for some individuals and helps them cope with chronic conditions. One of the key aspects for the work of patient advocates and expert patients is the acquisition and distribution of knowledge. Medical, biological knowledge is not something mystical that only some people can learn. Often it is sufficient for expert patients to build workable relations and collaboration with experts who are more knowledgeable than them. Research shows that this learning process itself is empowering and helps patients overcome much of the psychological stress associated with living with a disease, especially on the long term. Patient advocates should try to find common interests that allow them to work with all stakeholders. In case of HIV and other infectious diseases, such interests can be the prevention of transmission or the fight against stigma and discrimination. These interests may be different in other disease areas, but they will create a common platform for joint work to achieve shared overarching aims. Empowered patients are ultimately more aware and can transfer their skills to take part more effectively in political processes and be more influential as citizens. This model describes the collaborations between different stakeholders in medicine's development. Optimum conditions for innovation and knowledge are produced at the intersection where academia, regulators, industry, and expert patients collaborate on joint interests. This structure may look familiar to you also if you consider how EATG has been devised and works. The European Community Advisory Board on HIV and AIDS, called ECAB, is also a good illustration for this. The European AIDS Treatment Group is one of the oldest and largest networks of people living with HIV in Europe. Its activity is based on three pillars: scientific work pursued by the European Community Advisory Board on HIV and AIDS, or ECAB, and a dedicated staff member; policy and lobby activities done by the Policy Working Group and the Policy Officer; and training and capacity building with another membership-based working group and a full-time training officer. The mission of the EATG is to improve the daily lives of people living with HIV in Europe, and to make sure, both through scientific and policy work, that there is universal access to medication and diagnostics for HIV for all who need it. The EATG relies on a combination of volunteer work by its members, paid work in projects, and the work of paid staff in Brussels in order to be close to the European institutions. It represents the patient's perspective in research and policy work, and also provides regular trainings to expert patients and patient advocates. Rooted in a tradition of 25 years of advocacy and activism, the EATG also provides an unbiased platform for various stakeholders to interact in the fields of HIV and related illnesses like hepatitis C and tuberculosis. This model, however, is not without its shortcomings. One major problem is funding. Too much funding from industry risks the unbiased nature of the patient organization's work. Too much project funding is very volatile. Finding the right funding mix is often a challenge. Another issue is the availability and work capacity of volunteers, something that every patient organization will face at some stage of their development. One of the most important characteristics of the involvement of the EATG on the highest levels of medicine's development has been the solid combination of scientific knowledge and policy work. These capacities took years to build up, but there were also some unplanned incidents that facilitated the development process. One of them was when a pharmaceutical company, fearing that they would face the same fierce political opposition as with ACT UP in the USA, came to a meeting with bodyguards, only to meet a handful of tired and ill AIDS activists. The story made to the mainstream media, and companies decided soon after that they wanted to work together with the patient community in a different way. An objective, non-biased body, the European Community Advisory Board on HIV and AIDS, was created that was not associated with any company or trial specifically. Parallel to this work, there was a gradual development of political involvement as well. The biology and medical science of HIV is universal, and the issues and concerns of people living with HIV are very similar across Europe and the world, which made it relatively easy to develop common platforms for scientific and political cooperation. This push and the established frameworks of cooperation with the pharmaceutical industry have created sufficient leverage for organizations like the EATG to be acknowledged on the highest levels of decision-making, such as the EMA in Europe or the FDA in the USA. One important aspect is that the community of people living with HIV has always very consciously used to their benefit the fact that the HIV medication market is a very competitive one. As active participants in the medicine's development process, patients have a much stronger say in decisions about their own treatment in the most developed markets than in other disease areas. EATG representatives now sit in 3 different committees and working groups of the European Medicines Agency. While bound by strict confidentiality, several EATG members are also involved in the data safety monitoring boards and ethics committees of clinical studies. If cooperating with industry, EATG members usually get their honoraria paid to the organization to ensure impartial and objective work. The EUPATI website contains the description of 2 concrete cases when the involvement of the EATG and its US counterparty could successfully change study protocols to reflect the patient's interests more adequately. It is now common practice that the EATG receives study protocols and informed consent forms for review before they are implemented. It is a service that the EATG provides to the industry. The last 20 years of scientific cooperation with academia and industry has resulted in a complex but very functional network of stakeholders of the European AIDS Treatment Group. In this diagram, the width of the arrows signifies the intensity of the relationship. Please note that while the European Community Advisory Board, i.e. the scientific arm of the EATG, receives funding from the pharmaceutical industry, it also provides a service to the industry, supplying, for instance, expert advice or delegated members to data safety monitoring boards. It also gives advice to ethics committees and regulatory bodies. As an advocacy organization, the EATG also invests plenty of its resources into developing the capacities of other patient organizations and expert patients. The EATG is also one of the founders and co-chairs of the European Commission's Civil Society Forum on HIV and AIDS, which monitors and coordinates the work of the civil society in the field of HIV, and also liaises across patient organizations and European institutions. But the EATG and its members will also organize and participate in direct actions. One example was when activists in the Ukraine could make sure, through years of relentless work, that the number of people in treatment has increased significantly and the price of HIV medications has reduced by almost 40%. The European Testing Week is another community initiative supported by the European Commission. Its objective is to mobilize civil organizations and also public institutions to very intensively offer and advertise free HIV and hepatitis C testing throughout the EU for 1 week. Patient organizations have played an essential role in the success of this initiative in the last 3 years. All of these examples show that advocacy and activism necessarily go together. It is all about well-founded sound knowledge and finding the right balance in actions.